Hey there, today I'd like to go ahead and show you how to set up authentication in a Nest.js. This authentication is going to use Passport with JSON Web Token auth flow, and this will work for a GraphQL server or a REST API. And I'm also going to show you how to create a decorator to extract user information. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be starting off on the project that we've already done in the past in my Nest.js GraphQL video. I'll include the link to the GitHub repo for this project in the description. And if you'd like to follow along on how we created this, you can check out my previous video. So in this repo, I've created a separate branch called Auth. So feel free to check out that. Now there are going to be a couple of dependencies that we need to add on top of the project we already have. So let's go ahead and add those. So we're going to need Nest.js, Passport, Passport itself, Passport local. So go ahead and add those. After adding that, you need to go ahead and make sure you also have the types for Passport local. So since we're going to be implementing a JWT auth flow, we're going to also need to add Nest.js /JWT and then Passport JWT. Once that finishes, we'll also go ahead and add the types for Passport JWT. Now that we've added these dependencies, let's go ahead and generate a new module. So we'll use the Nest CLI to generate the module for us, and we'll call it Auth. Now that we've generated the module, let's go ahead and add the service as well, the Auth service that we'll use in our application. Now that we have the module and service, we can go ahead and start our server in development mode. So if we open up the source directory, we should notice that Nest has added the Auth module into our app module for us, and it has also created an auth directory, and in here we have the auth module with one provider, and that is the auth service. I'll delete the spec file for now, and we can get started with the auth service here. So in this auth service, we're going to need to do a few things in order to establish application-wide authentication. The first of which is we're going to need to set up a constructor that has access to our user service. And this user service is going to be used to establish whether or not the given user is valid or not. That is, if it exists, and we'll import it from user service. So since we're going to be using a JWT auth flow, we're going to need to now also inject the JWT service from Nest. And once that's done, we have everything we need. The first method we're going to implement is a method that will validate the user by email and password. So this will reach out to our user service and find out if the given user is valid based on the credentials that we have been given. We'll assume that this is going to be an asynchronous method because typically you'd have to reach out to your database to determine whether or not this user exists. In our case, it will be synchronous because we have a static list of users that we're defining and we don't have an actual database connection. So we can emit that. Next, we'll provide the parameters to this method, which will be an email and a password. You could use anything you wanted to verify a given user, but typically you'd have an email and password or maybe a username and password. We're going to return either a user if we found one or null if there was no user found. And we'll have to import the user model. So now let's go ahead and create a new variable called user, and we will reach out to our user service and we'll call getUser. Now if we take a look at our user service, we can see that getUser takes getUserArg. But now we want to implement a method that will get the user by email, which would typically only really be used internally in our application. So we'll create another method in our getUser service called getUser by email, which takes in the email and will return a user or undefined if we didn't find that user. And we'll return this.users.find, and we'll match the user email equal to the email provided. So this will search for a list of users and determine whether or not a given user's email is associated with a user that is already defined. So now in auth service, we can create a new variable called user and set it equal to this.userService.getUser by email. We'll pass in the email here. So next, we're going to go ahead and check to see if the user is not defined, so it doesn't exist. We'll want to return null from this method. And we'll see where this comes into play a bit later. So our last step in this method is to verify that the password provided in is the same password that is associated with a given user. And currently we don't have a password field on our user model. So let's go ahead and add that to our model. So this field is going to be nullable because we definitely don't want to be returning the password unencrypted or encrypted from our API. It'll really only be used internally, so it'll also be an optional parameter. Now that we saved our user model, we can go back to our auth service, and in here, this is where you typically would compare an encrypted password in a database to the password that is passed in. So if you were using a library like bcrypt, you would use the compare passwords method here. But in this simple example, we have unencrypted passwords, so we can plainly compare them in JavaScript. So I'll declare a new variable called password is valid and set it equal to password equals, with the equality operator, user.password. And lastly, we will return password is valid, and if it is valid, we'll return the user. If it's not, we're going to return null. The next method we're going to want to implement is a login method. And this method will take a user. And for a return value, this method is going to return an access token of type string. This will be our validation payload that we are going to want to return. So in the login method, we'll declare a new variable called payload, and we will set it equal to an object which contains the user's email and a property called sub, which will be set to the user ID, which is following standard JSON Web Token auth flow standards of including the email and the user ID, which will be attached to the access token payload we return here. So we'll return an access token by calling jwt-service.sign and passing the payload. So now this payload is going to be encrypted or transformed by the JWT service so that when the client receives it, they'll have access to the email and the user ID. And just add a comma at the end here. The last method that the auth service will be responsible for is verifying a token. We want to make sure that the token that we do receive is valid. So this is going to be an asynchronous method that will take a access token, which is just going to become in the form of a string. In most cases, like our validate method, this would be an asynchronous method if you had to reach out to a database to get your user. In our case, it's a synchronous operation, so we won't return a promise. It'll simply be a user. Now, before we verify the access token, we need to set up our JWT secret, which is a special variable that will be compared against our provided access token payload and the one that it was signed to determine whether it is a valid access token. So typically you would store this very important secretive value in a config service or environment variable file or config file, but for the sake of example, I'll go ahead and create a constants file and simply export it here. And this would usually be a long string. For the sake of simplicity, we will just keep it simple and export it. So this will become more clear when we implement the signing of our JSON Web Token, but for now, that we have a common value to verify against, we can go ahead and continue. So to get the decoded payload from a given token, we'll declare a new const called decoded and reach out to the JSON Web Token service and call the verify method, which takes a given token and it takes a options object which needs a secret, the JWT secret, which we use to sign the token, and now we need to use it again to verify to make sure that they match. So for our secret, we're going to pass in our JWT secret and make sure we import this from the constants file above. Now that we've decoded, we go ahead and get the user from our user service by calling the getUserByEmail method and passing in the email that is on the decoded JSON Web Token object, which, if you are paying attention, is in the same format as the payload here, is to return the user from the method. And we have completed our requirements for the auth service. So now that we've set up the auth service, there's a few things that we need to configure in the auth module itself. We're going to want to initialize an imports array here. And we'll first of all want to import the users module so we have access to the user service that we used in the auth service. Next, we're going to call the passport module, which we installed earlier, and call the register method on it. And we're going to specify that we want the default strategy to be JWT, which is the one we were setting up in this video. If you're not familiar with Passport and the way strategies work, I'll include documentation in the description, but essentially they're formulas for different authentication flows that are relatively agnostic of the underlying platform being used. So it's a great way to keep your code dry and maintainable. So lastly, we'll have to import the JWT module and call register. And similar to how we did with the passport module, we'll have to provide a couple of options. We're going to need to provide this secret, and as I said before, typically this would come in the form of an environment variable. You definitely would not want to check this into version control, but keep it in a config file. But for this video, we will use the JWT secret, which we defined in the constants file. We'll also provide a default sign options and specify that our token should last about 3,600 seconds. You can make this as short or as long as you want, depending on how long you want the sign token to be valid for. So one other thing that we have to do is in the users module, we need to export the user service so that the auth service can have access to it. So next we're going to go ahead and set up the passport strategies that are going to be used in our application. To keep things organized, I'll create a separate folder here called strategies. And let's go ahead and set up our local strategy first. So I'll call this one local.strategy. And this is going to be injectable because we're going to want access to the auth service that we have set up already. And we're going to export a class called local strategy. And this is going to extend from passport strategy. And we are going to pass in a strategy here. So this strategy is going to be imported from passport local. So this is what makes passport so extendable. We can pass in any sort of strategy we want here. And in this case, we want the passport local strategy. So as I said before, we're going to want to inject the auth service that we set up. So make sure we import that locally. And we're going to want to make sure we call the super here. And in this case, we're going to specify a username field. For this application, this is going to be the email, but this could be a username or whatever you want to use to verify usernames. So now we need to implement a validate method. And typically, as I said before, this could be asynchronous if you're reaching out to a database, but in this case, we're going to be synchronous and simply return a user. So make sure we import the user. So we're going to reach out to the auth service now, and we are going to call validate. We're going to call, and if you remember, we have to pass in the email and password here, and up here this should be password. So we're going to pass an email and password, and if we don't get a user back from the auth service, that means the user doesn't exist or the password is invalid. We're going to throw an unauthorized exception from Nest.js, which will automatically throw a 401. And if the user does exist, let's go ahead and return it. So now that we've set up the local strategy, let's go ahead and add one more. In this case, this will be the JWT strategy, which is what we'll be using in our application to validate our routes. Similarly to the local strategy, this is also going to be injectable. Export a class called JWT strategy. This is going to extend passport strategy, and we're going to pass in strategy. So let's go up and add our imports. So injectable should be from Nest.js, and import passport strategy from Nest.js passport. Lastly, we're going to want to make sure we import this strategy from passport JWT. So now in our constructor call, we will inject the the user service, sorry. And we'll have to make a super call. Now there are a few pieces of information that we need to pass to the super constructor. The first of which is a JWT from request key, and for the value we're going to pass extract JWT, which we import from Passport.js, and we'll call from auth header, which is saying that we want the auth token from the auth header in the request. We'll pass in a property called ignore expiration, and we'll set this to false because we do not want to ignore the expiration date on the JWT. And lastly, for secret or key, we will pass in the JWT secret, and we'll import this from our constants file. And make sure you've imported the user service from our application. Now, just like we did in the local strategy, we'll have to implement a validate method here. And the validate method is going to take a validation payload, which, if you remember from the auth service, is going to be in the form of email, which has a type string, and then the sub, which is the user ID, so that's a type string as well. And this is going to return user or null if the user is not found. So we'll return this .user service .get user by email and pass in the validation payload email. Make sure we import user properly. So now that we've set up our strategies, the last step to our application is creating auth guards, which will be used on a per route basis in any GraphQL query, mutation, or even REST API endpoint. We can easily add these guards. So following our pattern of keeping things organized, let's create a new folder here called guards. And we can very easily create these guards now that we have the strategy set up. So we'll go ahead and create a GQL auth guard. We'll go ahead and export a class called GQL auth guard, and this is going to extend auth guard from Nest.js Passport, and we're going to pass in JWT to correspond to a JWT Passport strategy. This is going to need a method called getRequest, which has a parameter gets passed in the current execution context. We're going to return type of any because we're going to pass back the current request. Let's go ahead and create a new variable called context. We're going to call it GQL execution context, which we import from Nest.js GraphQL. Call create, pass in the context provided, and then we're going to return context.getContext, and we're going to want to return the request object off of the context. So what this does is it passes back the current request object in a GraphQL context, and this will become important when we need to get access to the current user. So let's go ahead and create two more auth guards, one more for JWT. We're going to export a class called JWT auth guard, which is going to extend auth guard, and we're going to pass in JWT here as well. So this auth guard will be used anywhere in a REST API where we want to apply JWT authentication, and this auth guard is going to be used on any of our GraphQL queries or mutations, and they will both be using our JWT Passport strategy, which we've set up already. So finally, we'll create a local auth guard, which is going to be used in a special case to obtain our access token payload. So we'll export a class called local auth guard, which extends auth guard. And you probably guessed that we're going to pass in local here because this is corresponding to the local passport strategy which we created earlier. Next, in the auth module, make sure that we instantiate the JWT strategy and the local strategy, which we provided with injection. So we need to instantiate it here in the providers array. So one of the final steps in our authentication flow is to create a REST API endpoint that can be used in our application to obtain an access token provided valid user credentials. So in order to do that, we'll create a new controller here, auth controller. we'll add the controller decorator and pass in auth to prefix the route with auth. We'll instantiate a class called auth controller. And for the constructor, we're going to want to inject our auth service because we're going to need this to obtain the JSON web token. And we'll create one method here, login, which is going to return an access token payload, which has the form email. And we will return this.authService.login. Now, the login method needs to take in a user. Now, how do we get access to a user? Well, it is very easy to do given the work we have already done. First of all, we're going to add a decorator here called useGuards from Nest.js common, where we can pass in any guard. And in this case, it's going to be the local auth guard because we want to use the local Passport authentication flow, which given an email and a password will return a JSON web token. We'll also need to add the post decorator and add login to specify the route. Now, in our local strategy, when it is run by calling the local auth guard here on this decorator, this strategy will run the validate method, which if no user is found will throw an error. If a user is found, it'll return the user, and it's going to attach the user to the current request. So if we have access to the request, we also have access to the user. This is simple enough to do in Nest. We just need to add a request decorator here, argument decorator, parameter decorator, excuse me. We'll call it request, and it's going to be of type request. So we'll also import type request from Express because we are using Express under the hood here. And now for the login method, we can pass in request.user. And to satisfy TypeScript, I'm going to cast this as a type of user, which we will know it will be if this strategy correctly validated. I'm now realizing too that this return signature is actually incorrect. This should actually be of type string because we really are just returning a payload, and it's actually more specific. It's going to be access token. It's going to be access token payload, which is of type string. So we just need to make sure we import the user here. So now we have a route that will run through our local auth guard to obtain a JSON web token if the user is valid. So let's go ahead and test this out. So we also want to make sure that Nest.js knows about this new controller. So in our auth module, in the module decorator, we'll add a controllers array and pass in the auth controller that we have created. Now if we go to the console, we can see that Nest.js maps the route correctly. So let's go ahead and test this out now. So if I go ahead and pull up Postman and use localhost 3000 /auth/login, which is where my Nest.js server is running with the correct route, and we pass in a request, a post request, and send it, we're going to get back an unauthorized response. This is what we would expect off the bat. For the body of the request, I'm sending in an email and a password, but our server does not know that this user exists because it doesn't. So to test out our authentication, let's go ahead and add this user. So in our user service, we initialize our users array to an empty array, but let's go ahead and just add this one user here and make sure that the credentials are the same as the one that we're going to pass in. So dan@example.com with a fake password of my password. And we'll also need to add in a user ID and age to satisfy TypeScript. So now if we save our application, this user does exist and typically would be in a database backend of some sort with a hash password, not in plain text. But for the sake of this example, let's go ahead and try out a authentication request. And if we fire off this request now, we can see we're getting back an access token, which is awesome. What this means now is that our application has successfully recognized that this user is valid, authenticated, and provided us with a JSON web token, which we can now use to authenticate ourselves in future requests in our application. So let's go ahead and see how we would do that. So if we head to localhost 3000 /GraphQL, where our GraphQL server is sitting. Currently, our user query is not authenticated. That is, we don't need to provide any authentication, so anyone can run this query with its user ID that we have hard-coded in and get the user back. But say, for example, we want to restrict this query to only users of the application that are authenticated, then what we're going to have to do is add a auth guard to this route, which is very easy to do now that we have set up our auth flow. So in the users resolver, where we have our get user query, we're going to go ahead and decorate this query, and I'm going to call use guards, as we've seen before, and pass in the GQL auth guard. And it's as simple as that. Now all we have to do is save. We can go back to the query, and if we execute the same query, we're going to get an unauthorized response, which is what we'd expect because we're not passing in any authorization headers. So to solve this, in our HTTP headers section down here, we can pass in an object, and we'll pass in a key value pair of authorization, and we'll have the value equal to bearer, which is the standard format for JSON Web Token flow. And now we're going to need to pass in the token that we generated. So let's send another request to get a fresh token. We will copy the token from Postman, paste it here, and make sure there are no extraneous spaces, execute the same request, and now we get the information back because this is a valid JSON Web Token that our auth service has validated with the JSON secret that we provided in both places. So hopefully you can see the power of this authentication flow. It's very easy and extendable. So as a quick bonus, and something that's really useful in my projects, I'd like to show you how we can get access to the current user very easily with a param decorator. So to set this up in the auth directory, I will create a new file called current user.decorator. And inside of this file, we're going to export a const called current user, and we're going to call create param decorator from Nest.js. And inside, we're going to pass in a factory. We're going to get data, which we're not going to use in this case. So this is going to be of type unknown. We'll prefix with an underscore because we're not using it, but we will need the context, which is the execution context, and we are going to return a function here. Now inside the body of this function, what we're going to do is first check the current context, and we can do that by calling context.getType. And we're going to say if this context is equal to HTTP, so it's a REST API request, then we will return context.switch to HTTP, call getRequest, and let's return the user off of that request. So next we can say if the request isn't an HTTP request, but it is a GraphQL request, we'll create a new context variable, and we will use the same pattern we used earlier of creating GraphQL execution context.create, pass in the current context, and then we will call get context, get access to the request, get the user, and return it. So what this has done is it has allowed us to extract the user from an HTTP or a GraphQL request query mutation. So to see how this works in action, let's go to our users resolver, and inside the get user function, I'm going to include another argument here, and I'm going to create a param decorator, so at current user, which is the decorator that we created just now. So this is going to be a user, and we know it's going to be of type user because it's coming from the request. So now if we want to log out the user in this query, save, and if we now go back to our playground and fire off this request again and look at our logs, we can see that the query had access to the user object, the full user object, which we extracted using our decorator. So this was an example of how to create a decorator, use JWT authentication on GraphQL routes. And one other thing I'd point out is if you had another REST API endpoint similar to our auth controller, and you wanted to use the guard we set up there, you would just follow the same pattern of passing in the JWT auth guard. So this would guard any REST API endpoints you had, not the auth controller one we have here, because we use the local auth guard there. So hopefully this tutorial has been helpful to you, and you can use Nest.js authentication in your next project. Thank you and have a great day.